I am Leila Goshi, editor of Ballady Magazine. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Matthias Determann here today to discuss his book, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Astronomy, A Modern History. Welcome, Dr. Determann.
Thank you so much, Leila. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to be here.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to say a little bit about you and your biography first. You are a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar. You are the author of 4 books, including Islam, Science Fiction, and Extraterrestrial Life, and Space Science and the Arab World. And that is a wonderful book as well. Yes, and that too. Yes, I highly recommend all of these books. And you have also written for journals such as Science and Nature Astronomy. So I read your book from cover to cover, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as I read all of them cover to cover. And I just found this one fascinating. As we were saying before we went on, some of what you discuss in the book, some of the events that have happened, began to take form during the 1960s. And you even make the comparison in the book to a popular show at the time, Star Trek, and the diversity that was represented in that show, which I also found very inspiring at the time. And I will say, you know, as a young person, I just assumed that that's how astronomy and space travel was already, you know, when I was, say, 10, 12 years old in the mid-70s. So, you know, so I found that aspect of it very interesting as much as anything else. But I'd like you just to tell me a little bit about your book and what led you to investigate this topic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all your interest in my work. I am working at an American university in the state of Qatar. I'm teaching history. I'm originally from Germany, but I've been working both in a Qatari context as well as an American context simultaneously for the past 11 years. And I've been fascinated by ideas of diversity. Anybody who has familiarity with US higher education, as well as even US corporations, knows the importance of diversity and diversity discourses, equity and inclusion. So when I joined my American university, which is Virginia Commonwealth University, I had to undergo diversity trainings, and I have been doing these kinds of diversity trainings ever since. But I've also been working in Qatar, which is a small country, but an incredibly diverse country, a country where even the nationals of that country, Qatari nationals, are a minority. So almost a country that consists of only demographic minorities. Qatar is also like a multi-religious place, multi-ethnic, multilingual place. And so I've been living through the diversity of Qatar while at the same time learning about diversity in the United States. And sometimes I found overlap, but sometimes I've also found tensions. For instance, here in Qatar, a lot of people deeply care about, for instance, Palestinian rights. And just like in America, an increasing number of people fortunately do as well. But in America, for instance, the more prominent struggle in history was the struggle for African American rights and Black Lives Matter. So living in Qatar, working for an American university, I learned about these different conceptualizations of justice when it came to Arabs, Palestinians, as well as when it came to Blacks in particular, also Hispanics, Native Americans, and others in the American context. And I wanted to understand the history of these ideas of diversity. The name diversity, the importance of that name and the importance of that context is perhaps something that emerged during the last 30 years or so, ever since the 1990s. But of course, other concepts connected to that, such as equity, such as justice, ultimately, these are much, much older concepts. Justice probably goes back to the beginnings of humanity. So there is a history to diversity. There's a history to justice movements. And I wanted to explore those in the context of one academic discipline, namely astronomy, which also has a very, very deep and long history. So just like humans have always cared about justice, humans have also always looked at the stars, wondered about the moon, the sun, the objects in the heavens, and have told stories about them. So justice, diversity, as well as astronomy, knowledge of the stars, these two really, really fundamental things for humanity. I wanted to explore the relationship between those two in history.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what definitely appealed to me in regard to this topic, because looking to the stars really should unite everyone. There's this huge expanse. We all have questions. And so, yeah, understanding how it works within the field, how diversity has evolved within the. I was saying that space being a wide open area of observation for everyone has always led me to feel that it is a place of where we can all unite and all feel that we, are working toward the same goal. So that's what made me very interested in your book. But mentioning history of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is a lot of pushback within the US right now about, how diversity is impacting workplaces. And I think this book is also timely for that, because it can, we can learn from it. We can learn from what you've written and place it into other networks and corporations. But what it also made me think of, as we were discussing, the diversity of Qatar in general, I thought back about 15 years ago, a community college I was slightly involved with, not totally, had opened a campus in a country in the Persian Gulf, but did not have diversity training before faculty moved there to work. And ultimately, the campus was closed because there were, it was just not a smooth transition for most faculty members. And so I also want to acknowledge your ability and intelligence to, to demonstrate the importance of this, and to demonstrate really how to approach this subject. So, all right, there were some things that came up in your book that I was very interested in, and one was the story of Margaret Burbidge, who became president of the American Astronomical Society. And I appreciated that at one point she was offered an award a Women in Science Award, and she actually turned it down. This was in 1971 because she saw it as a way of still sidelining women instead of opening the door for more substantial appointments. And she did eventually become the president of the American Astronomical Society. So it sounds as if her goals and intentions, made their mark and helped set the tone for the rest of at least the 1970s decade. But is there more you can say about Margaret Burbidge?
Thank you so much. Margaret Burbidge is one of the most important astronomers of the 20th century. She is known for her research into stellar nucleosynthesis, which is the creation of the heavier elements in stars. So a lot of listeners might know that all of us are made of stardust. All of the elements in our body, the heavier elements in our body, were made in stars. And Margaret Burbidge, she was one of the pioneers of research into this stellar nuclear synthesis. So she was a very, very accomplished, very well known astronomer. And she was once offered the Annie Jump Cannon Award for Women in Astronomy by the American Astronomical Society. And she rejected that award on the basis that it was an award for women only. And she felt that this award was essentially given to women so that women would not get other more prestigious appointments. This was a time, you mentioned 1971, where you've had many, many, many accomplished female astronomers, but yet very few in positions of power. Burbidge herself, she was a professor, but at the time there were hardly any directors, for instance, of observatories who were women. But 1971 was obviously also a time when you had the civil rights movement in America having made great accomplishments, when women's liberation struggles were also very, very important on the agenda. These were, again, sort of the 1960s, 1970s, where a lot of things seemed possible, and where feminists, as well as African-American rights activists and many others were hopeful to create a better future, a more just future. And so she was hoping that she could transform her society and transform the astronomical profession and ultimately improve the position of women. She certainly succeeded in her own case, in that she became ultimately president of the American Astronomical Society. And since then, women have made important strides. So we have had more women in leadership roles in astronomy. Although, I mean, even until today, the struggle is still going on, the struggle against sexism, but the struggle against sexual harassment, for instance, but that is unfortunately still with us. And many young women until today, they're still striving for equity and equality.
Yes, women and others. I think what I thought of as I read through the book too. You opened with the story of the African Network of Women in Astronomy, which actually the first date that you mentioned of their work was in 2020. But even within, although that's not within the US, of course, but even within the realm of astronomy, this appeared to be a group that was working to help women of color, from African nations, and young girls and women who are coming up after them to have opportunities within the field. So I was really interested in that, and especially that there were two women, European women, who lived in South Africa but took up their cause. So could you explain a little more about that, and maybe what pressures or pushback they may have encountered?
Yeah, so the African Network for Women in Astronomy is a group that came together around September 2020. So the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, very, very difficult time for people around the world. These women were able to connect with one another, just like many of us did, at times virtually. And they try to fight patriarchy, improve the position of women, and at the same time advance astronomy in particular, and advance education for women and the development of African nations. Now, some of those issues, they seem to be at first sight maybe disconnected from one another. So advancement of astronomy, women's empowerment, development of African nations. But these astronomers have seen a lot of connections there. But they've felt that, for development, for progress of African countries to succeed, African countries would need to harness all the available brain power, so would need to educate women as much as men and give opportunities to women as much as men. And African astronomers also found that their own discipline was a very, very useful and important discipline for technological development. So astronomy, astrophysics uses high-tech instrumentation, uses huge amounts of data that are being collected by telescopes. Nowadays uses machine learning, artificial intelligence, like all these areas that people put a lot of hopes in for the future. And astronomers also felt that Africa in particular had things to offer that more developed countries in the global north did not have. For instance, southern skies, right? So there are stars that you can see on the southern hemisphere, including in southern Africa, that you cannot see in the northern in the northern hemisphere. So these astronomers believed in that they could advance women, advance educational access for women across the African continent, thereby contribute to the technological and scientific and economic development of African countries, and simultaneously advance astronomy too. So make discoveries that nobody else has made before them.
I love 2 points you brought up with that one, that brain power of everyone is needed, men and women. And as we were talking about before we started this online discussion, one thing that surprised me a lot as I was reading and thinking is that there's not more understanding among the scientific community of that time that all brains are useful, and it just surprised me that that the use of everyone has not in the past been prioritized. But of course, there's reasons why, of class and discrimination and things like that. And the other point you brought up was the southern skies. And that reminds me of a point you brought up in the book about ethnoastronomy. And I'd like to pull up a quote that I had actually put on a PowerPoint. And the reason I find this very interesting is the film that was referenced in your book. Is it Cosmic Africa?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. It looks at the history of astronomical observation in one scientist of African heritage. And when I read that, I thought, I wonder if we're just so used to hearing about observation of the stars among European folk tales that a comparative type of examination wasn't really accepted as something worth studying, but I'll bring this exact quote up so we can take a look at it. Yes, so if you don't mind, I'll read this point so folks will know. But in Cosmic Africa, which is the name of the film, Medupe, who is an astronomer, who made the film to explore his ancestral heritage in regard to astronomical observation. Medupe tried to reconcile the astronomy he learned with the one of his ancestors. He declared his mission at the beginning of the film: I need to discover whether my science has a place in Africa and whether Africa has a place in my science. His journey took him to the Johansi in Namibia, the Dogon in Mali, and the site of an ancient Egyptian observatory. During his visits, he learned about how traditional calendars have been used in agriculture and mythical stories told about the heavens. For the first time, I see how the stars affect the way people live, the astrophysicist noted. My science and my Africa are beginning to come together. In the Egyptian desert, he sees an assembly of stones used for tracing the movement of the sun. The origin of astronomy, its measuring and predicting, is in Africa, he commented. Stones took the place that my computer takes now. The attempt to connect modern astronomy to traditional knowledge of the sky also met skepticism. And then there was a quote by one of his critics who called it unfortunate that Medupe and his collaborators never explore any of the tensions between traditional, indigenous, and scientific worldviews. And I could see that as maybe, valid criticism. Just in general, but not a case for rejecting outright some important information. And then Horst Lemke criticized the documentary again and argued against the concepts of ethnoastronomy and indigenous science. In his view, practice and beliefs could be indigenous, but not science or knowledge per se. And I found that very odd because most people lived their lives just as noted by the calendar in regard to their agriculture, to sailing, to even times of the day, measuring time. So I don't know, what was your view of um, both the original attempt at ethnoastronomy and the critique?
Thank you so much. Thank you for pointing out these quotes. So we see here two different viewpoints.
Mhm.
One viewpoint that champions a stricter, a more narrow definition of what is science, what should count as science, what should count as truth, and then a more wider, a more inclusive, perhaps a broader a definition of what knowledge, including scientific knowledge, can be.
Mhm.
And these tensions you can find across the world, including in Africa, and including especially in a place like South Africa. South Africa is a very diverse place as well, like Qatar, like the United States, but with its own history, with its own notions and conceptualizations surrounding diversity. So, for instance, in the United States, Black people would be considered a minority. In South Africa, they are considered a demographic majority, obviously also with a history of discrimination. Um, uh, so in South Africa itself and in the wider African continent, you have these discussions, these controversies of what counts as relevant knowledge, what counts as true knowledge. There's this one German philosopher who is quoted here, Kai Horst Hemke, who only wants the modern scientific textbook definitions of science that have come out of the Western and largely European university traditions to count. So he is in some ways a purist, but he is also somebody who, is upholding the existing power structures within science. Science, of course, still being dominated by Western universities, by publications in modern European languages. And then Kai Horst Hemke's counterpart, who is quoted here, Medupe, he is trying to find aspects of science that are not just purely European. He wants to explore an astronomy that is broader, an astronomy that has a broader heritage, that does not just have a heritage in, let's say, 19th century German universities or 20th century European and American or Western influenced universities. He wants to explore a broader heritage of astronomy. And of course, he found a lot. Africa itself has a very, very long history connected to astronomy. One of the places that he went to was Egypt, North Africa. And of course, Egypt has, for thousands of years, contributed to knowledge of the stars.
Yeah, and I was very fascinated and excited really over the idea of ethnoastronomy. I had not really considered it before, as a field or a discipline. And while I also think I do think it's a good idea to examine different structures. And yeah, what do we consider pure science? What do we consider scientific observation, you know, versus folklore or folk wisdom? Yeah, but I do think there's room for it. And thinking back, for me and others in my elementary school, for example, I mean, our understanding of gravity was that Sir Isaac Newton sat under an apple tree and an apple hit him on the head. And that's why he discovered gravity, because that was kind of like the folklore, you know, that they would talk about in school, or being in scouting, and you know where the North Star is, so you know you don't get lost, you know, when you're out wandering around your campground, you know. So I find that just as valid in some ways of getting people aware. So I was very excited with this idea. Um, and so hopefully folks will move forward with that. So that brings me back to another main point in your book, which the overarching point, you know, of politics and science, and should there be politics and science? And I'm just pulling up the quote that Margaret Burbidge had again. But you know, one thing that occurred to me as well that I mentioned was that it seems there was always politics and science. It just wasn't social justice politics. But just because it was only men in science doesn't mean that there weren't class issues or other, you know, issues of competition. So, but both of those points, politics and science, and the ethnography of astronomy, I just found just so on point and worth even further discussion. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned politics and science. We talked a little earlier about, right, attempts to purify science, or to see science as somehow pure, which means seeing science as distant from folklore, seeing it as distant from superstition, seeing it also as different from mythology, from religion, and seeing science as distant from politics. And there are many, many champions of those views that science should be some kind of independent truth that has no connections to other areas of, I guess, human life, right? That science is dealing purely with nature and the universe, and like through a mathematical understanding. But well, one has to recognize that modern science, and especially big science, and science that involves large instruments, large observatory, costs a lot of money. And you therefore have to align yourself, you have to engage with the structures and with the people with money. So in order to be a successful scientific institution, you need to convince powerful people, powerful foundations, organizations, governments to become patrons. So modern astronomers who have relied on powerful people to give them money had to perhaps always engage in a form of politics. And at times these political activities by scientists were not always visible, they were not always controversial, Perhaps because sometimes these political activities were aligned with the dominant structures, with the dominant ideologies. So an astronomer or an astrophysicist would then be loyal to the existing regime. But what I've been very, very interested in were those moments, at least, when astronomers went against the dominant political structures, were trying to reform not just our knowledge of the natural world, but also reform our society. These were the points where astronomers and other scientists wanted to not just study distant galaxies far, far away, but also change our society here and now, and thereby challenge the existing arrangements.
Yeah, that reminds me, I'm not sure if he's challenging the system, but was it Neil deGrasse Tyson who mentioned he didn't necessarily favor military influence in astronomy? If I recall, within your book, I think there was that quote. Do you remember?
Right. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, very, very popular astronomer, perhaps one of the best known astronomers, full stop, certainly one of the very best known African-American astronomers. He wrote a book about the alliance between astrophysicists and the military. And he dedicated this book to all the people who wondered why astrophysicists had jobs at all. And so he wrote a history essentially about all the military applications of astronomy. And again, astronomy is sometimes imagined by sort of purists as sort of this ivory tower science that's disconnected from everything that is dirty and spoiled here on Earth, right? A science that just studies the heavens in their perfections. But he looks at, for instance, the history of the telescope, which has also had military applications, of course, all the way to the history of rockets and satellites, technologies that are dual use, right? So you can use a rocket to send a man to the moon or to send a telescope into Earth orbit, but you can also use a rocket to hit your neighbor. These dual use applications were some of the things that, well, powerful people, people in government, people in the military found very appealing. And Neil deGrasse Tyson makes the argument that this is indeed why a lot of astronomical, astrophysical, and space research has been funded, because it served military and political establishments.
That is fascinating. I have not read that book, and I'm now putting that one on my list as well, because I do find it interesting, just the progression of how one thing leads to another, and how, yeah, there are multiple uses for instruments that can be very beneficial, but not beneficial to society as well. But that's reminding me one more thing about Margaret Burbidge, who I'm starting to realize was very transformational in her role. There was something else in your book where she had thought that also increasing diversity, I guess because of the time, that more government funding might be available as well, because that was right after the civil rights legislation, I guess. And so that's just an example of maybe connecting government to astronomy in a new way as well. Although it probably would have happened either way, but.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So some of the political work, obviously, that professional science associations do is lobbying governments, foundations for funding. And Margaret Burbidge found herself in a position where she needed to lobby an African-American director of the National Science Foundation, who asked her pretty much straight away, well, how many African-American astronomers are there? She then had an incentive to essentially diversify the field, also so that the political elites, the changing political elites of the country, could also see that, well, many different constituencies have a stake in astronomy. And ever since, a lot of diversity advocates have made the argument, well, that if much of astronomy and much of science is taxpayer funded in the United States, well, then the sciences, the scientific professions should reflect the demographics of the taxpayers. So if there are not just white elite men paying taxes, then it shouldn't just be white elite men benefiting from the tax dollars spent on research. And maybe one could also make the science more appealing to the broader electorate by showing that, well, that science represents everybody, that science is for everybody, and that science is done by everybody.
Yeah. And just you saying that as well, one more aspect of the idea of diversity, politics, and talking all around this. I forget who said it, but within your book, there's also a quote that the numerical aspect of astronomy is also I guess, a doorway to diversity, or am I saying that correctly? Do you know which quote I'm talking about?
Thank you. I think this was one of the points of contentions within the book, that some people made the argument, well, that science, that astronomy are about numbers. Numbers are facts. Numbers are objective, and numbers and sort of quantifiable right information is then also democratic. However, there were also other astronomers, other activists who contested that, who knew that numbers themselves can be manipulated, that numbers do not necessarily reflect everything that's going on or are able to capture everything. So, for instance, one male Italian physicist, he made the argument that, well, he has been discriminated against because he had more citations than a female colleague who was ultimately hired for a job. And sort of he essentially argued for kind of reverse discrimination or disgrace. He was arguing against a discrimination against men, and he was making the argument, well, that in a meritocracy, the positions should go to, well, the most accomplished scientists, the scientists that have accumulated the most citations. There were obviously great critics of that, people who pointed out all the politics that lead, for instance, to certain citation counts, that just because one has a lot of citations doesn't not necessarily mean these citations were earned meritocratically on a level playing field. Nor does it mean that citations should be the only measure why somebody should get appointed for a job. So numbers are very, very important for all physical scientists. Many physical scientists know the importance of numbers. They cherish numbers. They cherish quantifiable evidence. They cherish statistical relevance and statistical significance. But also many scientists also know how easily statistics can be manipulated or shaped too. So discussions, controversies in astronomy were not just about words, not just about ideas such as equality, diversity, and what they mean, but they were also about the importance and the meaning of numbers.
I had a lot of questions about that particular area, and that helps clear up a lot, because I wondered, did that extend? Are they extending that to test scores, or are they saying anyone who has a good test score, that's a democratic way of showing who can be involved or not involved? But the point about citations, anyone who's been through hiring processes, I mean, there's so much that goes into it. Whether is the research relevant? Is the person's current research relevant to what the organization is trying to do? Very fascinating, actually, that whole topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm curious, are there points I haven't covered in your book that you wanted to bring up as well? I feel like I delved into different things. Yeah.
Thank you. I think one of the things that attracted me to astronomy, apart from its age, apart from astronomy being such an old science, is that astronomy has these tensions between inclusivity and exclusivity built into them. That on the one hand, astronomy is a very universal discipline, right? Astronomy, knowledge of the sky, knowledge of the stars, has perhaps always existed, has existed in every culture, in every language community. So humans have always looked up at the sky and wondered about the meaning of it all. So astronomy can be a very inclusive, very democratic discipline that could embrace everybody. And indeed, astronomy has one of the most venerable amateur traditions of all the sciences. So you still have, until today, in many, many countries, amateur sky watchers, sometimes making quite significant discoveries. At the same time, however, astronomy has also been very close to physics. And physics has been a discipline that has been very hierarchical, at times that has a great differentiation according to money, according to prestige. Physics has also been a very male-dominated discipline. Physics has been a discipline very close, especially during the Cold War, to the military-industrial complex. So physicists have developed nuclear weapons, as many watchers of the film Oppenheimer will have known. And well, if you look at, for instance, Nobel Prize winners in physics, most of them, with few exceptions, right, with Marie Curie being one of them, most Nobel Prize winners have been men, have often been elite men. And if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, you probably have not found many female scientists in that movie. So astronomy, being very closely connected in modern times to physics, also has this tendency to be elitist, to be exclusive, to be exclusionary. And indeed, nowadays it is harder for many people across the world to have an equitable view of the sky, right? Most of us humans, we nowadays live in cities where our view of the sky has been blocked by pollution, including light pollution, and where elite astronomers have resorted to ever more exclusive locations, mountaintops, or even outer space, where the James Webb Telescope or the Hubble Space Telescope are located. So astronomy has this tension of being, on the one hand, either for everyone, being by everyone, or on the other hand, being done by an elite circle for elites. And I think that's a tension that has been in astronomy's modern history, a tension that's still ongoing.
That is a great point. I've even thought recently, you mentioned the James Webb Telescope, also the, a lot of images are available on the NASA web pages. But there's always they say that they release everything, but there's always that part of me that knows that there's like a filter, there's a mediator between what, our high tech can see and what the average person is aware that it sees,
Absolutely.
And so that's like a division, I guess. Again, kind of a class and more a class division than a political division, I guess, in terms of being able to educate yourself to get to that place of access.
Absolutely. And also like sometimes sort of deep mutual suspicion at times too, between the haves and the have-nots, right? So on the one hand, yes, there's so much astronomical knowledge available nowadays on the NASA website, on NASA social media accounts, on Wikipedia in open access papers and databases, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a deep suspicion that, well, still governments are hiding something from the common people. That, for instance, the community of UFO enthusiasts, right? The people who are interested in unidentified aerial phenomena, they feel, well, they're deeply suspicious of government and feel that government conspiracies are hiding other objects that might be in the sky. And of course, the suspicion is mutual in that sometimes elite scientists would look with great disdain at UFO enthusiasts, right? Would try to delegitimize them and describe them as pseudoscientists. There are ongoing discussions of knowledge that is accessible, knowledge that should be accessible, but also like suspicions about what knowledge is not shared.
Yeah, and people, back to just this idea of humans observing their world. People are great and very insightful observers. sometimes, and do often notice if something is not quite right. You know, something I think of recently, that there was some underwater spot off the coast of San Diego on Google Earth, and people, people start zeroing in on it, saying, what is that? And then I guess a while later, the next Google Earth image kind of showed it airbrushed. So you couldn't really see what the original structure was. I mean, they had images of the original one, but so, who knows what it was, but yeah, people are great observers. And with technology today, you can hang on to a lot of things and make comparisons, So we'll see where that goes in the future. But something I want to end with, because I was reminded of Star Trek and the ideals of, the 60s and that popular show, which you very astutely helped use as a sense of our human ideals in astronomy. Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, I found a quote of his with the cast of the original Star Trek. And Gene Roddenberry said, Star Trek was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, to take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that is almost certainly out there. So that was Gene Roddenberry. And, I feel that fits the intent of your book, and a lot of what I took from it. So thank you. Thank you for writing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Astronomy. Would you like
Thank
to
you
make
so
some
much.
closing remarks?
Well, thank you for bringing up this quote by Gene Roddenberry. I mentioned earlier how in astronomy we have this tension between inclusivity and exclusivity, science for the few or science for everyone. Astronomy, space are also uniquely connected to the futures and the futures that we imagine, right? Space travel is inextricably linked to science fiction, to literature of the future. So astronomy, what astronomy can look like, what it should look like, the demographics of what the astronomical profession could look like, is also linked to our ideas of the future. Gene Roddenberry had a very optimistic view of the future at a time when, in many ways like our times, there were great struggles. Gene Roddenberry's original Star Trek series came out in the late 1960s, a time when the United States was engaging in a terrible war in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, with many civilian casualties, the victims. This was a time of great divisions and strife at home in America as well. This was a time of the civil rights movement. This was a time also of political assassinations and assassination attempts. If people nowadays, for instance, feel that, well, the 2020s have been marked by, well, the genocide in Gaza, or by the George Floyd protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, the calls for decolonization, some of that was also at the time there in the late 1960s, the calls for decolonization, the movements for rights of women, rights for minorities in America. So this was, a time of great pain, a time of great conflict at the time, the late 1960s, just like our time. But it was also a time where Gene Roddenberry had this very optimistic view of the future, where he envisioned that we as humanity could overcome our differences, that we could overcome capitalism, right? In his view, in the United Federation of Planets, money has been abolished. That he had this view of people of all races, all human races and even non-human races, exploring the stars, the future together peacefully. Star Trek was also the first mainstream television series that featured an interracial kiss at the time between Lieutenant Uhura and Captain Kirk. So here, envisioning a future where black and white people could be lovers, could be explorers of the universe together. And this particular show resonated with people. It struck a nerve, and it really established a fan base, like, I don't know, perhaps only rivaled nowadays by the Star Wars fan base, which developed afterwards. But this positive utopian Star Trek imagination shaped so many people in the late 20th century, early 21st century, and it has shaped many astronomers too. So many of the astro activists, the astronomer activists that I've spoken to, many of them, they grew up with Star Trek, and they saw, for instance, people like Lieutenant Uhura, or Commander, later Captain Sisko, or Captain Janeway from Star Trek Voyager as heroes, right? Seeing people of color, seeing women as commanders of spacecraft, really inspired many astronomers to become leaders themselves.
Yeah, I wondered if Margaret Burbidge was watching Star Trek episodes at night, since she was, you wrote about her work in 1971, so maybe. And it's also occurred to me, and then we'll close, but just as you were speaking, it occurred to me maybe the Enterprise is kind of symbolic of our planet. Here we are just rotating through the stars and exploring them, and hopefully we can become, like the Enterprise someday. So
absolutely. I mean, this was the time when the idea even of Earth as a spaceship emerged, right? That we are here on this planet going through space, and well, we are stuck with what we have, right? We are stuck with the resources that our planet has, and we should make the best use of it, and we should take care of our planet, because it's the only planet we've got. Just like if we were on a spaceship, we better take care of the spaceship that is housing us.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. This has been a very fascinating discussion. I've enjoyed it, and I appreciate you coming on to talk about your book. And I look forward to reading the next one as well. So
thank you so much. Thank you, Leila. Thank you for having me. And I'm so delighted about our common interests in space, in science fiction, as well as in questions of diversity, equity, inclusion, decolonization, justice, access. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.